Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Westin MCAT podcast. I am one of your hosts, Azaii Muniz, second year at this point, medical student at Harvard Medical School. Really excited to be with my co-host.
Congrats on finishing that first year. That's quite an accomplishment.
Thank you.
My name is Phil Hawkins. I'm the MCAT director here at Jack Westin, as well as I went to med school at the University of Nebraska Med Center, where I was an MD PhD student. So we're here because I've been through this process. Azaii is in the middle of the process, and we're just kind of talking about like how students can make a good study plan. That's the topic of today, of making a plan for dealing with the MCAT. We all know the MCAT is a monster of an exam. Most students aren't taking exams that are 7.5 hours long. And I would say like the average student, maybe I'm kind of curious, like how long do you think like the average student is probably spending in terms of prepping for the MCAT?
Yeah, so I think it's like you said, quite a span. But in my experience, usually 3 to 4 months. If a student has more time on their hands or they have fewer commitments, then they might switch to a longer study plan, something like 6 months. Just really depends on the student.
Yeah, it does, and like I would agree. I think it's like 3 or 4 months is kind of the average. Every once in a while, you do have students that have a little bit less time. I personally think that becomes really difficult to like prep for the MCAT in 2 months, or like 6 weeks or something. Occasionally, you run across students that are trying to do that. I think if that is the case, you have to have a really strong background. And it also really helps to not have much going on in those like 2 months or 6 weeks or whatever. If you're a full-time job, and if you're doing a full-time job and you have a family and like kids you have to take care of, and you're also taking classes at night, like I think like 6 weeks or 2 months is probably not going to work. But if you have like, oh, I'm just off this summer for 2 months, I'm just going to spend 8 hours a day studying, maybe that would work. And I have seen that work for some students, but I would agree average is around 3 or 4 months. I have worked with students for a year and a half before in the past. And like, obviously more time is better, but I do think there are some diminishing returns because like eventually you kind of like start to forget, like, what was I learning about like 11 months ago? That's really hard to kind of like hold on to this. And I think that that's one of the big challenging things with the MCAT is the stuff you're studying today, you need to remember in order to be tested on it in like 2 or 3 months from now. And so having a good study plan is really crucial for that.
Yeah, I think we talked about that in one of our earliest podcasts, right? That the way that you study for the MCAT is different because you have to remember information longer term, right, than studying in undergrad. And so finding ways to repeat that information in a way that's productive is key to actually succeeding on this exam.
Yeah. And I think a lot of students feel like I need to have all the content down and I have to have it memorized to the point where I can regurgitate it. And I am 100% confident on every single topic before I take a practice test. And those students are the students that don't take a practice test until like 4 months in. And they're like panicking the whole time because they never feel like they've mastered the content. And that's because in undergrad, like you can, like I have an exam, it's covering like 3 chapters in this book. So I'm going to master those 3 chapters to the point where I could teach it. But the MCAT is so big. It covers multiple years of like full-time undergrad study. And so as a result, it's really hard to kind of like sit down and like master to the point where you can teach all of those. So a lot of students are looking for like a study plan of like this many weeks for this, but because students are so different, some students have jobs, some students are taking 3 months, some are taking 4, some are taking 5, and 6 isn't all that uncommon. Like a year is pretty uncommon, but like 3 to 4 is, I'd say that covers probably like 60 to 70% of students. But then there's another like 20, 30 that stretch it out to like, 5 or 6 months. So instead of talking about like specific, like week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, I always like to talk about it as like breaking it up into like thirds or chunks. So like, for example, the first chunk or the first about third of your prep for me needs to be mostly about content. Just making sure that you're comfortable with each of the topics. A lot of students want to start off doing a lot of passages, but if there's a passage about insulin and you don't know what insulin is, like it doesn't like you can't do the passage because you don't have the prerequisite content. Now, even if you do know about insulin, that doesn't mean you're going to get every question in the passage, because there's a lot of like data analysis and critical thinking and like putting stuff together, making connections that you have to have that content there before in order to do, but that doesn't automatically get you the point. So it's really hard to work on that like critical thinking, data analysis stuff if you don't have the content down. So that's why I always kind of like want to start with just a content like overview, kind of a shotgun blast of we're going to hit everything a little bit. Is that like, how would you look at that as kind of like the content versus strategy portion?
Yeah, completely agree with you. I think it's so important to make sure that you have a solid content foundation before you start trying to tackle MCAT style questions. And I think we've also mentioned this. The MCAT style questions that are passage based, and also the discrete questions to a similar extent, require you to piece together, right, information from the passage, content that you know, and they're going to stretch your use of the content you know, because you're going to see techniques, you're going to see data that you aren't familiar with. And so having that solid content foundation allows you to look at this new information, right, and actually make sense of it. So that's why
especially because those like content things will cover multiple topics, where it's like you have to understand capacitors and like neurons and like circuitry in order to answer this question with actual like MCAT style. And so that's kind of difficult to be tackling those if you just know about neurons.
Yeah. And we also like to, you guys are hoping to be future doctors, right? So we also like to bring some future techniques that you might use in your long-term learning. And so it's similar when you go see a patient, right? If you don't know the underlying mechanism, just kind of following the insulin trail of diabetes, right? How are you going to know which medications to prescribe? How are you going to know how to interpret their lab data if you don't actually know what's happening, right? So you're going to use this style of learning and application throughout your entire career. So practice working on it now, and it's going to pay off in the long term. But completely agree, first, third, content, and then shifting gears towards more strategy application.
Yeah, I'm having like daydreaming nightmares of like, what if in med school they didn't do it that way, where it wasn't content first? What if day one they're like, here's a patient, try to do something, right? Like that's that's like impossible. And that's why, like, as you know, as I like in med school, like the first half of med school is really just reviewing content, like making sure that you know these things. And it's not really till like the third and fourth where you're like interacting with patients on a daily basis, like one after the other. And so I never really thought about that, but the way med school works is kind of the same way that I actually recommend students to work on the MCAT. Yeah.
Yeah. And something else, we haven't yet touched on when to start incorporating strategy, but you're not learning the content in an isolated bubble, right? Mm-hmm. You're learning some of those strategies and application as you progress in your understanding of the content, right? So as you're learning, so you get the basics of how diabetes works, right? Insulin, glucagon, et cetera. And then you start applying it. And so something that we do in classes, we do case-based learning. So not all medical schools are like this, right? But we actually go through the content first, mostly on our own. And then in class, we're applying it to theoretical patients, to cases. And so we're still doing content along the way, but we're saying, okay, how might this present, right, in a patient? And so as you go through MCAT studying, you're going to do something similar. You're going to start learning how the MCAT and the AAMC tests the material as you're going through the content. And then you're going to say, okay, I'm learning this new content, right? How might they test me on this? What types of passages might I see? And so you'll probably start with, and Phil, feel free to chime in, with some of the fundamental questions on the Jack Westin website, right? But then as you go through, roughly between the first third and the second third, you're going to start incorporating some practice passages and dipping your toes in the water, so to speak, and seeing, okay, these are the ways that the MCAT's going to test this content, right? And then shifting gears into more frequent application and practice passages, et cetera.
Yeah. Just a quick like clarification. The fundamental passage or the fundamental questions that we have at Jack Westin are are questions that are not designed necessarily to be MCAT style, because they're not like bringing together multiple topics and tons of data analysis and those sorts of things, which you would see in like our practice passages, which are meant to mimic the AAMC. But the fundamental questions are more designed to help just make sure that you have like individual content ideas clear. And I think practicing that is really important. I like how you're saying, like, as you review content, it's not just like memorizing a bunch of stuff, but as you are studying the content, you should be thinking about how is this going to be applied. It's absolutely something we do in the course where like, for example, when I'm teaching magnetism, right, I'm like teaching the right hand rules, but then all of a sudden, like, okay, let's talk about how a mass spectrometer works, because that uses magnetic fields. And like the MCAT, when they're asking about magnetic fields, there's a good chance that they're going to ask about like how magnetic fields can be used in different devices. And so like instead of the MCAT just giving you a bunch of numbers and asking you to calculate the magnetic force, instead they're going to give you a passage about a mass spectrometer, and they're going to give you a table of a bunch of different molecules and ask you like, what's the interpretation of each of these things? And so because the MCAT is always asking about that application, as you are studying content, you should be thinking about like, how are they going to be testing this? And that's something I like spend a lot of time in the course talking about. Pretty much every topic, I'm like, all right, here's the idea behind it. Here's probably how the MCAT's going to test it. And so like that should be shaping the way that you are studying, kind of like thinking about how the MCAT is going to cover each of those topics. We're going to talk about that a lot more in a future podcast about like what's going on in specific sections and how the MCAT's going to test those. But we should probably, we started like segue into that like middle third, which is where like you're not done with content, but you are starting to work in some practice questions. And if you don't feel like you've mastered the content, that's normal, right? Like that's how it's supposed to be. Once again, a lot of students feel like they can't start to practice until they have mastered everything. And that is, I'm just going to tell you, it's never going to happen. The MCAT is so big and so broad, and you don't have to have every nuance memorized of like the pentose phosphate pathway, but you do like need to have like a general overview. Also, because the MCAT is a multiple choice test, you don't need to like recall from scratch everything. You need to be able to recognize, and recognition is easier than recall. Like if I asked you to draw cholesterol, most of you guys couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. But if somebody asked me like, which of these is cholesterol? And then they showed cholesterol, a polysaccharide, a protein, and then DNA, I'm like, that one's cholesterol. And that's how the MCAT is structured. So note that you don't have to be a perfect master of like cholesterol in order to like answer that question. You need to have just a general overview. And I think that goes a long way. And students aren't used to that because they're used to, once again, in undergrad, trying to memorize every single aspect of everything, because that's also how undergrad tests. And the MCAT's a little bit different with this like multiple choice stuff. So as you're doing like the application side of things and that like middle third, you're still going over content, but you're also starting to apply this and make those connections between those different topics. Also getting a good idea of how the MCAT is actually like asking questions, and then what thought processes you need to have in order to answer those questions.
And I think it is worth mentioning that different content requires a slightly different approach, right? So the amino acids, for example, if you have looked even anywhere, right? Even Phil, I believe you did a video on the amino acids. You've got to have those memorized, right? Yeah. That's non-negotiable for the MCAT. There are some topics, right, like the pentose phosphate pathway, where you really only need a very general understanding of it. Whereas something like the electron transport chain is intermediate, right? So you're going to have a very strong understanding of it, but you don't have to have every single enzyme name memorized, right? Or exactly, the structure, I should say. You wouldn't even need to know the structure of the enzymes. Whereas something like glycolysis, right, you should have an idea of the difference between the structures of, glucose and G6P, glucose 6-phosphate.
Yeah. And that's a very frustrating thing for students, because they want to know how much do I need to know about each and every single topic? And that's something that we know. Right. That's something that I'm like, okay, on this topic, you don't really need to know this. On this topic, you definitely need to dive in. Like amino acids, you got to know those forwards and backwards. But like it's hard to explain that to a student, because once again, like the MCAT isn't testing 4 topics. It's testing like 1,000 topics. And to explain what you need to know about each one is kind of difficult. The way you learn that, though, is by seeing questions. And so that's why that second phase where you're seeing, like, applying a lot of stuff, you start to get a better understanding of, I thought that I was like really bad at kidney stuff, but turns out I've gotten like every kidney question I've seen. And like, I haven't mastered kidneys, but I know enough to answer what the AAMC is looking for. And that helps. That comes in that second thing. That's a really big problem. A lot of students have been like traumatized by certain courses in undergrad, and they feel like, I don't know physics, I don't know orgo, but then they take an exam like an MCAT and they're like, oh, they got all the physics question and the orgo questions. Even though they don't feel like they know it, they're great at it. And so that's why it's also important to do a lot of this application. It kind of segues into this like third portion of your prep, which is aiming a lot more on the application side, but specifically lots of exams. I think that like once you get into that last like third, you should be spending time taking an exam, reviewing it. Now, a big portion of that, like generally most of the time, like the content is done. Like you've covered all the content probably at least once by the time you've gotten to that third portion. But you are not finished with content. So even though you have hit everything in terms of content, you're not like done, because once you get to that third section, you take an exam, you miss some questions about like endocrinology, then you go back and you read up on endo. And so you let in that third portion, I think this is something that is a little bit tricky, and why I have why there's some difficulty with like people giving study plans, like study schedules of just follow this study schedule to a T, and then you'll be perfect, and then you'll get a great score, because everybody's a little bit different. Some students are going to struggle with timing. Some are going to struggle with endurance. Some are going to struggle with data interpretation or math skills, or like even just specific content things. Like we could have 50 students that all have content gaps, but they're never the same. And so some students will be really good at some things and weak at others. So in that third portion, you are figuring out, like via an exam, what are the things I need to work on, and then you work on those. And so you're hitting each of those things, and you're improving. You're hitting your weak areas. So you're still hitting content, but only when the exams tell you to hit content. Don't go back and go over things because you feel like you need to. Go back and look over it because the exams say you need to go back and look over this. That's my PhD like side coming out, like data, right? It doesn't matter how you feel. What matters is the data. And so if the data shows you're missing like 40% of your orgo questions, go back and look at orgo. But if the data shows you're not missing any orgo, even though you don't feel like you're good at orgo, don't look at orgo, because it's not a good use of your time.
Yeah, and there are two things that I want to make sure I mention. The first is, we said, it can be difficult to know how much you need to, or how in what depth you need to understand different pieces of content. So this is where you can actually we have content pages for a lot of different topics. And so
our
take
AAMC
a look.
Outline that we have. Yeah.
And so take a look at how in-depth each of these pages are, right? So the amino acids page is very thorough. And so that's a hint, hey, I should spend more time on this. Whereas some of those psych topics, right, they're listed 1, 2, 3, and a brief example. And that's the degree that you need to understand the content. Something else, along that same line is we have the Jack Westin Advanced Solutions for the AAMC questions and practice passages. And so we also kind of talk a little bit about that too. And so we'll spend more time, right, on either topics that are difficult for students and difficult questions, or content. If you go through some of those exams, you'll see that we keep saying amino acids are important to know, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So some of those ideas will be repeated there. And then the second thing I wanted to mention is, you might be listening to us and saying, okay, so the last third of my studying is really hitting the practice questions and going through exams. Now, that doesn't mean that you won't take a practice exam sooner, because, for example, if you're doing 3 months of studying, you should have done a practice exam before that last month, right? So there's some flexibility to this. And the first, few exams that you do, you're also going to be building stamina, right? This is a 7.5-hour exam. It is not for the faint of heart. And so you're going to build up that stamina by doing practice exams, by doing timed sections. And so making sure that you incorporate that and stagger it is going to be important. But that's why we're not saying, the first 2 weeks do run, using a 3-month example, the first 2 weeks do a full length, right? Because not only are you not, you have very little content knowledge unless you have a very strong exposure to the content in undergrad, but it's also not a super great use of your time. Whereas a little bit later, you're going to say, okay, I have a stronger content, base. And so I can start also, taking a look at how these questions are applied. That's why you start doing practice passages as well. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind that we're letting you know it's going to be different for every student, but you also shouldn't leave all of the application to the very end, all of the full length to the last month or so.
Generally, if I'm working with a student and creating a study plan based on their strengths and weaknesses and kind of what's going on with them, I'll add in the first practice exam, maybe somewhere around the halfway point. So kind of in that middle third, maybe a little bit more towards the beginning of that, maybe a little bit later. Kind of, for me, it kind of depends on how strong is their content. If we need to spend more time on content, I might push that back a little bit. But if the content's solid, then we might move it forward a little bit earlier. So maybe right as you transition from that first third to the second third, maybe we'd take a practice exam. But that last section, that last third, the practice exam should be the majority of what you're doing, where it's just an exam, tells you your weak areas, hit your weak areas, and then go from there. I also think it's really important in that last third to make sure that you have worked through all of the AAMC material. That includes the QPACs, that includes the section banks. Currently, as of right now, they have 5 exams, the unscored exam and the 4 scored exams. You want to make sure that you have gotten through all of those. The section, just as a word of warning, just a heads up for everyone, the section banks are, for my money, the hardest prep material from the AAMC. I think any of the passages on the section bank could show up on an exam, but the section bank is just hard passage after hard passage after hard passage. I know that there's a passage in the bio section bank that in order to finish the passage, you have to interpret I think it's 11 graphs. And that's the MCAT's probably not going to make you do that 3 times over an exam. So the section bank, just a heads up. I know a lot of students go in there and they come out feeling like an idiot, kind of bruised and battered and I don't know anything. That's normal. You just want to make sure that you, at least in hindsight, understand every question and every passage. But I just want to give that word of warning out there. I absolutely love the section bank. If you can make it through the section bank, all 3 sections, and you understand it well, then you can handle anything that the exam is going to throw at you. But it is a daunting task. So just a heads up about the section bank. It's probably my favorite prep material, but it is very difficult. I would rather a student practice at a very high difficult level, and then on the day of the exam, they're like, oh, this isn't so bad, than the flip, right? I would much rather have that than a student who practices on easy stuff and they show up on the exam and then they find that it wasn't as bad as, or it was way worse than they thought it was going to be, and they didn't feel prepared for the exam.
Absolutely. This is something that you're going to come across throughout your entire career, right? If you only learn the easy or typical presentations of, just, again, I'm in that student mode in part. Yeah. You're going to have a lot more difficulty when the atypical presentations come along, right? And then something else that I think it's so important that you touched on, Phil, and it's, you might go through some of this practice material and be a little frustrated, right? And that's normal. There are growing pains in studying for the MCAT, as there are with your entire future career. You're constantly learning new material. And so expecting yourself to get a perfect score the first time around is not reasonable, right? Unless you've seen a lot of this before and you're super, super confident in that particular topic and the application of it. Don't let that stop you from moving forward, right? You're going to take that information, you're going to say, okay, this is a data point, right? And so I'm struggling with this, but it makes sense in retrospect, right? you're less likely to miss that question a second time around because you're saying, okay, I struggled with this, but I'm going to get it right next time. And so constantly using that growth mindset, and we talked about this at the very beginning. It's one of my favorite phrases, and it's probably the one that I strive to live by these days. It's progression, not perfection. And so you're going to keep moving forward as long as you're willing to, and as long as you put in that effort. So when you get to that section bank, when you come across a difficult practice passage, don't allow that momentary discouragement stop you from continuing to move forward. Really important idea and mindset to have.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that probably deserves an entire podcast in and of itself, is talking about how to review exams and how to be viewing things. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think a lot of times students get frustrated because they've studied all the content and they show up for the exam and there's a passage about something that wasn't in the content. But that's how the MCAT structures their stuff. They throw those curveballs at you that they don't expect you to know about this topic, but they do expect you to be able to apply your knowledge to this topic. And that's a slightly different thing than what students are doing in undergrad. And so a lot of times students get frustrated because they're like, I've been studying for 3 months, and where did this come from? Just out of the blue. I'd never heard of circular dichroism chromatography. Why is this? Why do I have to do a passage about it? But just kind of keep in mind that that's kind of the way that the MCAT is structured, is you have to have this content and then you have to apply it. That's also, just as a good side note, that when you take that first exam, don't put a lot of emphasis on the score. I know that a lot of students, at that point, let's say you're doing a 3-month prep and you take a practice exam halfway through that second, third. And so you're 6 weeks in, you've been working hard. You've been covering a lot of content. You've learned a lot. And then you take this practice test and you don't do well. That doesn't mean that you haven't been progressing, because the MCAT is taking multiple topics and putting them together. Let's say in order to answer this question, you need to know data analysis and about endocrinology and about fluid dynamics. And so it's something about aldosterone and how that affects blood flow. And so if you've been studying and you all of a sudden, I understand the endocrinology, and let's say I even understand the fluid stuff, but my data analysis is weak, you're still going to miss that question. That doesn't mean that you haven't made progress, right? Because to answer this question, there's 3 things that need to occur. And at the beginning, you couldn't have done any of those 3. Now you can do 2 of those 3, but you can't do that last third. So you still don't get the question. That doesn't mean that you haven't been improving. And that's why it's hard to measure growth, especially at the beginning, because there's so many pieces that need to come together, and why it can be really frustrating and students lose motivation. But just keep that in mind. Kind of stick to it. Most of the time I see the growth in terms of scores in that third section where you start to see things kind of trending upwards. And I know that can be very frustrating for students when they are doing lots of practice questions and practice passages for months, and they it doesn't seem like they're getting any better. And that hurts, right? Because that's the most frustrating thing in the world. If I don't work hard and I don't get better, that's fine. If I do really well on something without working hard, that's fine. What sucks is when I work really hard and then I do bad on something, right? That's the most frustrating feeling in the world. And so a lot of times students start to get discouraged. But keep in mind that progress, kind of making it through here, there's a lot of things that need to come together in order to really rock the MCAT, and it takes a while. This is why we're saying 3 or 4 months is kind of you can't. Most students need to do probably at least 3 or 4 months in order to prep properly, because there's just so many pieces that need to come together. But following this plan, first third is mostly content. Second third is a lot more application as well. Maybe work in an exam. The last third being practice exams, reviewing, hitting those weak areas. I think that is just that general idea is probably what every student needs to do, beginning to end.
Yeah. And we've spent, the bulk of this time covering how you should generally approach your study plan. And you might be saying, okay, Azaii, Phil, what do I do on a weekly basis, right? What do I do on a monthly basis? And so just kind of three thoughts that I have as we kind of, wrap up. The first is build in breaks. right? We've touched on this in the past. You do not want to burn out. And so a general good rule of thumb, right, is build in a day off each week. And so make sure that you have time to take care of your other non-MCAT needs. And so that's also going to help you prevent that burnout, which when students, have been making progress and all of a sudden they dip, that's often what is underlying that.
Yeah.
The second thing,
I can't believe we got this far into talking about a study plan without talking about days off, because that is critical. There's a lot of students that are like, I'm going to prep for 2 months. I don't have much time, so I'm not taking a day off. I'm like, that is a bad plan. You probably about at least 1 day a week is what I would advocate. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. I just can't believe that we hadn't talked about that. That flabbergasted me when I realized.
Yeah. And so, and some students might say, okay, y'all are talking about a day off. That's fine. It's, great for everyone else, not for me. Think of it this way. If you get burnt out, right, it's going to take a lot of time to truly reset and to come back from that. I've had students who burn out and then they end up needing 2-3 weeks to kind of come back from that. And that's really problematic when you're working with a set schedule. So building in that time proactively, super important. The second thing that I want to note is have some flexibility in whatever schedule you set up, right? So recognize that something might come up. There might be, for example, a family emergency, or there might be an exam that you end up having to study a little bit more for than you anticipated. There might also be weeks where you have extra time, right? And so you can say, okay, the time that I didn't, really get as much as I wanted to last week, right? I can make up for it this week because I actually found this exam, studying for this exam, in school to be a little bit easier. And so give yourself that flexibility to adjust as needed. Which brings me to my third point. Reassessing your schedule on a weekly basis, 5 minutes, can be really helpful, right? So you're saying, okay, I'm hitting all of my targets. That's great. So this is, the study plan is working. But then you might also realize at the beginning when you're going through that content, hey, it's taking me a little bit longer than I thought it would take me, right? So saying, okay, I need to adjust my study plan as needed. Now, that is not licensed to slack off. Because sometimes students will say, okay, so I have the flexibility in the plan and I'm just, I don't have to put in quite as much effort as I might otherwise want myself to. Hold yourself accountable. That's incredibly important. If you need to, have someone else hold you accountable. If you're studying, if you have a couple friends who are studying for the MCAT, tag team that, right? You can have other people help hold you accountable as you progress in your career. You're going to have to get used to holding yourself accountable for your growth goals. So this is a good time to start transitioning into that mindset as well. But that accountability is important because the last thing you want to do is slack off for an exam that you've been is important, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be having these conversations and that you care about.
Yeah, that's a really funny thing like that, like accountability thing and staying balanced. So even without outside stuff, which there is a real world out there, there's family and emergencies and real life issues you need to be able to be flexible for, but also just some topics as you're studying will probably take longer than you thought you would need. And some might go a lot faster than you thought you needed. And so just understanding that, I do think reassessing is good. Just in terms of having somebody hold you accountable. One of my best friends sets monthly goals for himself, and his wife's mother, so his mother-in-law, he sends those to her every month at the beginning of the month, and then at the end of the month she calls and's like let's go through this checklist. Did you get all these things done? And if he didn't, then he has to pay her $100. And so it's having this accountability person, and he's constantly worried about I can't let down my mother-in-law because she'll be grumpy at me, and then I gotta pay her. But that's having somebody, you don't have to pay your mother-in-law money, but having somebody that will hold you accountable is really useful. It's very motivating, rather than just yourself. The downside is a lot of times people set goals that are unattainable. So be realistic, understand that you do need some flexibility, but just kind of be aware of all of those things. Note that last third that we kind of talked about, everyone is doing different stuff when they get to that last third of what their weak areas are and what to do and how to hit those. And so keep in mind that there is a region in your prep that is designed for you to go back and like hit your weak areas and like, review different things. And so just kind of understand that's there. So if you feel like you're falling way behind, keep in mind that there's this chunk that is designed for you to be able to kind of go back and hit things if you need to.
Yeah, and that's something very quickly, with goal setting, right? Some of you might have heard about SMART goal setting, right? So things like specific, measurable, right, time frame. These are all important ideas to keep in mind as you're setting your goals. But I think that setting up a attainable study plan and reasonable study plan at the beginning, important. We've hit a couple of key ideas and topics, and we're going to have future podcasts that talk about reviewing exams and how to approach different sections. So stay tuned for those. We're going to walk you through that, but just make sure that regardless of where you are in your current studying for the MCAT, that you take a moment and assess your study plan. Phil, anything else that you think we need to cover before we...
There's a lot of topics that I'm like, I want to dive in a lot more on this, but then I'm like, you know what, that deserves its own thing because I could talk for an hour on that topic. So yeah, as I said, keep on the lookout for future things coming down the line. And we're gonna flesh this all out together as a team. You, me, and Azaii.